Yeah.
All right, Brent Cooper, thank you for being here. For our listeners, you are a political sociologist and a leading metamodern theorist. You're from Canada right now. Are you from Canada originally?
Yes, I do have dual citizenship with the UK through my father, for whatever that's worth these days. But yeah, born and raised in Canada.
All right. Okay.
And always, just for context, always had a kind of affinity and love-hate relationship with US culture, because it's our neighbor to the south. It's a superpower. It's 10 times the size of us in terms of population. It's got enormous influence in terms of policy and spillover effects. And of course, we're similar enough. There'd never be any kind of conflict or war again. But I focus on American politics a lot, not to like detract from other places, but to look at geopolitics. Right. American politics is an excellent lens for geopolitics, and the US has a special relationship with the UK too. So it's also interesting to view it through that lens.
Yeah. I mean, I think like everybody has a love-hate relationship to the United States right now, because it's such a weird, interesting and country, it's like so many good stuff spilling over, so many weird stuff. And anyhow, so you wrote a piece, Metamodernism and the Left, which is available like all your other stuff on your Medium page. I will link to that. And so that kept us kind of going conversation-wise, because I think, or I thought at least, it fits in the broader conversation, that we're having culturally right now. So what happens after postmodernity? What happens after postmodernity, like politically wise? Zach Stein talks about the time between worlds, and there's the question: okay, will we transcend the kind of left-right duality, and or will it oscillate between left and right, or will the future be left, right? And so before we come to your article, it struck me that we're always using this kind of placeholders, left and right. And because you're like a sociologist, so let me ask just blunt this question: what does left even mean nowadays, right? Because if we are approaching this, and if we want to understand what's happening after postmodernity, I think it's pretty useful to know what we're talking about, and especially because we're talking. Sorry, we were talking about America a little bit. So even if you just look at America and what the left might mean, it's like from the dirtbag left on the one side to Clinton, Obama on the other side, and all that is in between, and all the different things. It's kind of difficult, and that's just America. And then we have Canada, and we have Europe, and within Europe. So I would like to use this chance while talking to you to kind of get a sense about what left means, could mean, should mean maybe, and how that kind of relates to metamodernism. So that is the plan here.
Yeah, where to begin? It's so I try to note in the article that like it's always going to be awkward to talk about left, right, like they're equally opposed, or that their directions, or that they're words with weight and baggage, that through language it complicates things. But in the basic sense, we can't get away from these terms. There's many political spectrums. I think they're all useful, even some of the more contemporary meme ones, that kind of make fun of the political spectrum. But broadly speaking, in a way that I think everybody should understand and be able to relate to, there's a political left, a center, and a right wing. And America is a good kind of place to take the temperature of that, especially going back to the 60s. They had the term the new left, which is like the Chomsky types, and they're anti-establishment, anti-war, very progressive, very ahead of their time, right? And very unpopular, because you have people like Martin Luther King, like he was hated, right? And America forgets that history. and all the assassinations and whatnot. So there's always been a left slash socialist, because I should use those terms kind of synonymously too. And then centrism and liberalism kind of go together. And then, of course, right wing and conservatism go together. And just to be clear, because there are people who get this confused a lot still, like Jordan Peterson is one of them, but fascism is particularly Nazism is exclusively a far right phenomenon. So historically, like that was a far right party in Germany. And there's this confusion that like left-wing people are fascists. The appropriate term, for better or worse, of course, is communist, and at the extreme, and they try to have communalize everything and community and commons and all the sort of semantic coincidences there, right? And so there is authoritarianism all over the spectrum, of course, but it's also a particular pole of many political spectrums. So also, through the kind of focus of my piece, I'm trying to reorient with these terms so that among a lot of progressive people, voters and academics alike, there's this kind of implicit consensus, sometimes explicit, that the new center that's trying to emerge, where a new political spectrum would be kind of oriented around, is what the contemporary left is representing. So Bernie Sanders style politics that is just about universal healthcare, universal education, like better gun control, drug legalization, dismantling the military industrial complex. Some of these things are typically exclusively left-wing projects, but they're all, by and large, all trying to advance some sort of universalist project, and not at the expense of individualism and people's autonomy and freedom. But the fact is rather that, like with Scandinavian social democracy, we all have more freedom if there's more equity, more egalitarianism, more universal policies. And healthcare, of course, is one of those baseline human needs that not only should it be good and sort of free at the point of service, we shouldn't even be stuck in the mud of the debates of these things. And America's far behind the rest of the world, right? In these terms, like most healthcare systems are to a large extent socialized, and public healthcare systems, whereas in the US, it's hyper privatized. It's all about that bottom line. So left has this tradition and historical meaning of socialism and free thought associated with that. But in the contemporary moment, when you look at surveys and polls in the United States, like the majority of people, just writ large, support universal healthcare, support universal education. Something like a Green New Deal it is a very high level concept that's been brought down to the kind of layperson as this platform that includes, job guarantees and energy policy reform and massive investment into these things, and based partly on the historical New Deal, which to a large extent was a success. And so I get a lot of pushback when I invoke leftism, because, like you say, like with whether it's Zach Stein or other people, there's this notion that that's breaking down, that we're in a long-term transition, whether it takes 10 years or 100 years, we're in some sort of turmoil, birth pangs of a global civilization. And but my thesis, quite unabashedly, is that to get there, we need to coordinate and align along some political policy issues, social issues, and that's going to de facto mean in some elections and in some instances that we all become leftists. We all become kind of radicalized in a healthy way. We all become kind of revolutionaries in a kind of soft way, if you will, right? Because, you know, we don't want a violent revolution. We just want to actualize the so-called paradigm shift, right? Like it's happening, but we also have to make it happen. We have to participate in it.
Well,
and
if
mhm.
I can jump in there before we go to your piece, because I think it's what I mean, talking about left and right, and maybe we should start with a historical survey, because as least as I understand, left and right, these terms were kind of invented with this French Revolution basically, and so there were people like sitting on the left of the king, wanted more equality and wanted more equal rights, and then on the right side, the red ones, they wanted the kind of tradition hierarchy that went along with the monarchy, and so the right-left polarity was kind of born, right? So that's the basic DNA, let's say, which reverberates till today, at least as far as I understand it. If I'm not correct, you have to correct me there. But then you have additional aspects of it. Let's say, the Jonathan Haidt explanation. So it's, the right is more about boundaries, and the left is more openness, and one are more progressive and the other one are more traditional. All these kind of things. But how if you had to write down like a 2-sentence definition of what left means, just to get just to start. So what would you say?
Yeah, I'd say the kind of top line policy issues, the way I'd simplified is like aggressive climate change solutions, like systemic, like I said, Green New Deal. And with that, the other point would be massive reduction of systemic inequality.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So economic and environmental kind of revolution, essentially, because in the last 10 years, 12 years, since Occupy was the Occupy movement. It was a global thing. There's over 900 events. I went to the one in London, a very, very salient message, despite what detractors and critics would say about it. Okay. And that is that we have extreme wealth inequality, and it's incredibly harmful and dangerous and hypocritical. The irony is, like, what's happened since then? It's gotten worse. And it's like you have a consensus, even among a lot of billionaires, that it's bad. I think it was Warren Buffett and friends that kind of try to push this thing called the pledge, where they give away half their wealth. And so things like that are good. I'd still rather have them politically advocating for systemic change than just their sort of libertarian trying to, paternally help people with their money. But, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, they've just gotten richer. So, and climate change has gotten worse. And that problem with climate change is nested in 100 years of denial, of systemic denial. So that's what I would say the left, those two things that they focus on. And naturally, you can see that this applies to everybody. Conservatives should be on board with that too.
Okay. So what you're proposing is to define leftism through its projects, right? So that's what I understand. And I was wondering and that's what is so interesting to me, because I'm coming from Europe, you're coming from Canada. We have like kind of different, worlds we inhabiting and we're living in. For me, stuff like healthcare and climate change, it's like even the conservative parties are Germany on board on that. So this kind of definition you having doesn't really apply to, the German landscape of left and right. And so if we would think about leftism as, in a universal kind of thing, independent, because, yeah.
I know what you mean. And we've kind of talked about this before, like the fact Germany has many more parties, for example, than the kind of just two-party system of the US. I know what you mean. We could spend some time unpacking that. But I would make a counter argument that most of the leaders of these countries will fit into a certain box, right? Like Macron in France is a centrist. He's an Obama style, kind of Justin Trudeau style, kind of liberal centrist. In the UK, Jeremy Corbyn is very far to the left. And so you have all these other, Keir Starmer is very much in the center, the dead center, as Luke Savage calls it. And then Boris Johnson, he's clearly right wing and panders to the right, and the messaging is consistent with that, with Brexit and everything. And so with each of these countries, with each of these leaders, there is a way to distill and to simplify, and this applies to South America. Brazil, another great juxtaposition. You have Bolsonaro, far right. Okay, Bolsonaro is like Trump. They get along, whatever. But then you have Lula da Silva, very much like a Bernie Sanders type figure, very much left wing. And so all over the world, there's enormous diversity in political systems, in language and culture, and the media, and the voters. So the way that's presented, the way governance and participation actually function. But it still tracks with these different zeitgeist blocks, and it kind of simplifies into those three competing worldviews, if you will. And right. I think that distillation is the first step going beyond left and right, just to recognize there's like what centrism is. How do we disentangle, what that is? Like you mentioned, Bill Clinton versus the dirtbag left. Like there's a huge chasm there in terms of discourse and policy and the Clintons of the world are trying to do something very different. They're very establishment. They're very embedded in different networks, and so in some ways that kind of paralyzes a certain type of action. Anyways, there's a lot that could be said about that, about that sort of Clinton dynasty and that type of politics. But I think even despite your point, which makes sense, people and voting blocks can be grouped into those three main categories.
I completely agree with your description of the political leaders. I'm just, just to be a little bit annoying, I still don't know what left means.
Okay. Yeah, that's why I said
it's something that I can infer, mm-hmm. right? It's like mm-hmm. a cloud or climate, like a worldview, an algorithm or something. But mm-hmm. what is it that Clinton and the dirtbag left has in common, and with the German left? What is if you have to put your finger on it,
in the broadest sense, yeah, yes. I think it is kind of like you said, going back to the French Revolution. Like I think that still tracks. It's interesting in the United States, it was the Republican Party that sort of voted to end slavery, and then there was sort of a flip. There's a whole historical story there about how the parties flipped. Yeah, I think in the simplest sense, like if we're trying to figure out what it is about a kind of like Clinton being left leaning, what they have in common with a far left radical contingent, it does track with sort of the origins of the French Revolution, so that the left is about the people and the right is about capital and order, and whether that's monarchy or aristocracy, it tracks. However, a lot of scholars, Marx included, would be keen to point out that these things are in flux, right? So you can have class traders in a good sense or a bad sense. You can have people, you can have mobility in politics, in class, such that the definitions change over time, right? And that adds to the complexity. And let me just zero in on the concept of wokeness, right? Like just in our lifetime, in a generation, that term has been born and has gone through many transformations, and it tracks with the decline of postmodernism too, because there was lots of criticism of postmodernism in the 90s. And in the last 5 to 10 years, it's like that was forgotten, and we're reliving it as a culture war redux. And so these terms change, because woke originally meant a good thing. It meant you're awake to the general oppression of the system. It also meant awareness of systemic racism. And so it was kind of a code word to subversive culture, to counterculture, to say, like, you get it, you're awake, and you see through the matrix, or like that movie They Live, kind of a classic cheesy conspiracy thriller.
It's a good movie,
if you will. All of the messaging, like obey and stuff, it's like, it's very on the nose, but it's also like it movies can be good like that. Like, they distill kind of aesthetics into a very basic form that you can then like identify with and reflect on. And so, wokeness is supposed to be a good thing, about breaking free of those conventions of control, which are abundant in society. We're all raised on it, even in a mild sense. Like, I used to watch a TV sitcom called Married with Children. I watched it as a kid. It's an incredibly sexist show, like, by definition. So there's this it's just infused in culture, but it's also, today the term wokeness is very triggering for a lot of people. There's a whole anti-woke campaign, and it basically, like, if you take far right pundits like Ben Shapiro, he's losing his mind every day, calling any kind of diversity in a movie, like, if there's a black person on screen, they're like, oh, it's wokeness, it's the woke, like, left-wing mob, and they want to make a communist utopia. And it's just pure moral panic based on the changing nature of these terms. And that's right. So to bring it back to left, right, leftism, it's complicated. It doesn't have to be. I mean, we can think of like Che Guevara, leftist kind of revolutionaries. I think that's the more academic legacy of leftism, is like rock stars like Frank Zappa, or revolutionaries like Che Guevara, like that they're leftist in that extreme radical left sense. But to bring it home, to get away from these left-right terms, as I said in passing before, like, leftism kind of is synonymous with socialism, which in the past 5-6 years has become, particularly in the United States, has become a more acceptable term, which is a new thing in the United States. And it's all about continually defining and unpacking what it is in a truthful way. Obviously, I'm not a Maoist, I'm not a Stalinist. I think those are just historical kind of traditions and times and places to study and understand. But we can't get away from these words, however much baggage they have. So contemporary socialism is the most, in the sense of Bernie Sanders and Scandinavian social democracy. And there are some criticisms potential there, but it's the most benign thing. It's not about, taking away from people, but it's about facilitating a kind of abundance economy, which is really possible now. Like, I don't know if it was always possible. It might have been. There's a lot to be said for, if we could truly structure society to be just and balance all those things, people's want for freedom and for assets, and with a general freedom, with universal healthcare, stuff like that, we'd have a much more depolarized society, and we'd have a much more educated populace. People would be better at abstraction, meaning thinking, and the way it corresponds with and shapes reality, shapes policy, and the reflexive relationship that has with our thinking, right? So, because it shapes what we think and what we do and vote for, shapes us back and shapes the next generation. And just a quick note on this that jumps into my mind. In America, obviously, they have a huge gun problem. It's not that. Yeah. Yeah, we don't even need to get into the data. There's more guns than people, but it's not that complicated. This is one of those topics I want to demythologize and just to depolarize and simplify. Instead, what you see happening in the US, like with school shootings in particular, I'll tell you what the solution is absolutely not, and that's to arm teachers. And that's what they're pushing in some of these red states, is to arm teachers. And not only arm teachers, but like arm them after 24 hours of training. And I tweeted to somebody this morning, like, no amount of training would make it appropriate for a teacher to have a gun, because that's not their role. And I would make the argument that a lot of police shouldn't even have guns, which is why in England, in London, police often don't have guns. That's not part of their method. And because it doesn't work, frankly, it just creates a culture of fear and intimidation and potential violence and real violence. So this is the insanity that I'm trying to help, break through with clarifying these terms, with resetting these terms and realigning people, right? So like I say, if we could all become provisionally leftists on particular issues, if not all issues that are appropriate, we'd actually be able to win democratically and, have gun reform, gun control, and reduce and ultimately eliminate gun deaths and mass shootings.
Okay, so let me just jump in there, because obviously from a European perspective, guns and what's happening in the United States, it's kind of appalling. I just read that I think like 4,500 kids were killed last year alone through school shootings. That's that's so. But if we look at the United States, obviously we can't use like a European formula to understand all these phenomena. And so, and then what's your take on Thaddeus Russell? I don't know if you know him, if you've read his book, but he has like a twofold argument. And so first, that he's a critic of the left, because you said the left is about people. He would say something like the left never was really about the people. It was about controlling people. It was expansionism. There's lots of war going on, especially if you look at, the left from the Clinton side, not so much like, So, and then zoning in on the gun issue, his argument would be that gun control as a meme, as an idea, emerged because the Democrats wanted to control the Black Panthers. And that's how the whole thing, that doesn't have really anything to do with the NRA or something, but more about, controlling people. And so for him, that's the argument for him, or in his way, critiquing the left. And so what do you make of this?
So I think points like that can absolutely be valid in context, but not in a reductionist way. Like if he's making a reductionist argument, whether intentionally for effect or accidentally, I have to oppose it. I have to say that's wrong, because I like that you bring up the specific point about the Black Panthers, because there's always going to be lots of kind of counter examples like that. Like, what about this? What about that? Because there's abundant evidence that the war on drugs itself, this is before the Black Panthers, but the war on drugs was started also to control Black people, right? There's a lot of explicit statements, a lot of explicit evidence for that. But you can still make the argument that the war on drugs was just meant to control people generally, race aside. So both things can be true, right? And then with the guns and the Black Panthers, like that can be true too. But I would never reduce it to that, because America does have a long, complex history with guns. In terms of when they came about historically and how it enabled mass slaughter, and the NRA absolutely is a major factor, a major sort of, by some measures, terrorist organization in terms of what they advocate ideologically and also in terms of policy. and they do so unabashedly, right? Like it's just and a lot of it depends on Second Amendment type arguments, which then you can problematize that too, because the Constitution was written by white men in a certain time and place, and so so I'll make those points, but then I'll make a broader point about Thaddeus Russell that I think, from what I know about him, he's got some good leftist bona fides, but he's also part of, I think, quite obviously quite of a kind of reactionary left, which is like Spiked Online as a publication, which I used to think was okay, but it's just increasingly kind of like Marxist reactionary. And then also this new Compact magazine, which Zizek is a part of, even, right? So it's got some kind of legitimacy there, with Zizek being, I think, an editor. But a lot of it, much of what I've seen, I saw the day one when that magazine came out, I saw MMT, Modern Monetary Theory advocates criticizing it and taking it down. And so I took a deeper look, and I saw a lot of just bland anti-woke stuff, like arguments, sort of against the excesses of gay and trans activism or racial activism or whatever it is. So it's there's a kind of class reductionism. There's a kind of, they're trying to build a certain type of consensus, I suppose, but it's predicated on a little bit too much of capitulation to these right-wing talking points, or these themes that in discourse we're all participating in an evolving language game. And so we get these terms like wokeism, if you get it from a right-wing source, or even a centrist person who's kind of laundering or trafficking that right-wing source, the meaning gets lost. And then there's only meaning in the author's intention, and then the reader's interpretation. And then we get stuck in this kind of spiral, which there's a sort of gravity effect that sucks the energy and the momentum out of the organizing and out of the policy formulation that would be traditionally leftist. So I think there's a lot of fragmentation on the left, and Thaddeus Russell is a good example. He's kind of between different groups, but like
he's also a contrarian, no? As a libertarian, character-wise, a contrarian. He likes to,
That's a good term. I'm glad you brought that up, because I use that term often to kind of call people out, because I think just as a general rule, I think contrarianism is pretty unhealthy. It's like, by definition, it's stemming from a kind of reaction, and you're trying to contradict or be contrary to someone else's position. And so that's why, given that I'm talking about Thaddeus Russell, I'm trying not to reduce him to anything, but you've given some good labels there. But I'm also warning against what he might be doing in terms of reducing the issues, particularly guns. Like, I haven't read his gun position, but take Sam Harris, for example. I used to think Sam Harris was a genuine progressive intellectual, but on a number of issues, he'll sound smart, but he's actually quite weak. And guns is one of those issues, because for him, it quite in a straightforward way, it comes back to, if I live in a dangerous neighborhood and I want to protect my family with a gun, I like to train in jiu-jitsu with my bros and blah blah blah. And I'm just like, intellectually, there's no argument there. It's just that he wants a gun to, quote unquote, protect his family. But that, if you really have a kind of moral standard and policy literacy, that it's better to live in a world without guns, right? Like that, hunting aside, sure, for example, like gun culture is incredibly dangerous, and it saturates all of our discourse, video games and Not, not to make a absolutist argument that that's all bad and video games cause violence, but it does saturate our culture. We grow up on action films, and certain actors like Bruce Willis, for example, like sort of become a cliche in terms of they're always their characters often have a gun. And the movie, portrays guns as a solution.
But we have your movies. We have American movies in Germany. There are no gun deaths in Germany. So.
Okay. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So for Sam Harris, it's just like, here's a case of a public intellectual. He's very confident in his views, very articulate despite being wrong. And at the end of the day, he thinks falsely that a gun will make him safer. And the statistics say that there's there's babies that get their hands on the guns in many households. You can have it in a locked box and everything, but then there's just trade-offs. Like if there's a home intruder and you're fiddling with the
Sure.
lock on your, it's like, why are we even going down this road of debate? It's what I call a non-starter. So there's lots of non-starters that contrarians will put forward. Like, oh, what about this? What about that? It's like, actually, that debate's been had. It's a bit of a non-starter. We should.
Yeah, well, he's coming back to Thaddeus Russell. He's a contrarian, yes, but his argument still is that not all of it, but a huge part of the left and the Democrats and the progressives is about controlling people, and he traces it back to Max Weber and Protestantism, because that's what it is, and so that's the question.
Yeah, I guess I would try to disentangle the center from the left. And again, to build agreement with you, these things are murky, they're in flux. But like Protestantism, and the work ethic there, I'd say that gets recuperated, for lack of a better word, or consolidated back into neoliberal
right
capitalism, which is a centrist thing. Like neoliberalism as a policy is kind of neither right nor left, right? And that complicates things when it comes to the way Thaddeus Russell's talking about things. He's actually, it sounds like he's critiquing the center, but he's targeting the left because of that kind of alignment. When we talk about, Bill Clinton is a left-leaning politician, but what happens is the center, because of neoliberalism, sells out the left agenda. Right. So universal healthcare, they sell it out. They literally sell out. And, the part of the tragedy is, I didn't always understand this fully, but I always viewed Jimmy Carter as one of the most progressive, benign kind of presidents. But he himself, I think, is largely responsible for kicking off neoliberalism, kind of like signing off, like, let's do this, And so, one could make the argument in that case that Carter was a progressive person, but also kind of naive, and also kind of, wanting to satisfy his peers and compromise. You have to make compromises. A term I use often in politics is satisficing, meaning like you make trade-offs and you settle for a suboptimal outcome. Right? I think politicians have to do that. I think Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, I think they do it all the time. It's a good systemic critique, but I don't want to validate it as a method, right? So like Bernie Sanders, even if he was president, he would have to make trade-offs and deals and compromises, sure, but he would hold true to the baseline proposition of a given policy, right? And he's got a lot of policies across the board, which actually create a type of synergy. So if we were, we have a collective action problem, generally speaking. Again, it's not a left-right thing. There's a collective action problem, but we do have to kind of unite, which means having these deep conversations, having solidarity across party lines, but also having conversion, having changes and having alignments so that we can break through the impasse. And, the irony and the tragedy of like being involved in metamodernism and getting to know a bunch of different, liminal web spaces and thinkers, it's really depressing too, because we've been stuck. We've been incredibly stuck. It's like everything's been frozen in time since 2015, when there was actually, it felt like there was potential, focusing on the US again, that there was potential for the kind of, to catalyze the paradigm shift we were all advocating for. But it was, because of the sort of post-truth climate that came about in 2016 and Trumpism and all the things that happened, you can see and you can form explanations in how it was almost predetermined, because so much was invested in that culture, in setting that up. And so with Trump, like a great example is The Apprentice. It's like you have this reality show culture, this hyper-capitalist competitive sort of meme that they're trying to propagate, which then becomes a kind of addiction for people that like, oh, I'm going to get on the show, or I'm going to win the lottery, or I'm going to like make it big with my business. And that is kind of entangled with that Protestant work ethic that you bring up.
Right.
And all of this, the capitalist energy in the center, so to speak, has this gravity that just sucks people towards it. And so we'll in our circles, we'll in left spaces all the time, but even in kind of meta spaces, we'll talk about Mark Fisher and capitalist realism, just his concept there, how difficult it is to get away from the hegemony of capitalist culture and the functionality, for lack of a better word, of capitalist culture. Like the machine keeps turning. Obviously, there's tons of people that get crushed and rolled over by that, but there's enough kind of proof of concept that can continue to be the dominant ideology, even if people don't realize it consciously.
Well, I'm kind of thinking the last days about climate as a metaphor, right? Because we are not having this climate crisis. I'm thinking about it as a metaphor for, all the systems that are kind of affected, political systems, the climate of the political system, of media, of our culture per se. And it seems to me that all is in disarray. It's like you can't look at CNN and make the case that it's less propaganda than Fox, So just as an example, and everything is in disarray. And what I'm looking for is a kind of leftist ethos, So because it gets all so murky about what you say it's complex and shifts, the conversation shifts, but at the same time it's so opaque in a kind of way. And I don't know if you have seen that new documentary, What is a Woman, from Matt Walsh. I don't know. So it's a brilliant piece. It's a brilliant piece of propaganda.
Of propaganda, yeah.
But also it highlights the weird stuff on the left, right? It's very well done. They're very. The tricks that he employs are pretty obvious, but at the same time, he highlights some aspects that even are kind of prevalent in Germany, right? And so. And so I'm still kind of looking for the ethos that we want to transform into a next, let's say, metamodern era, because obviously there are some things on the left you don't want to transfer, right? And so how do we sort this out? Because what's your take on this?
Yeah, there's very few issues, if any, on the left that I would kind of retreat from. So this issue about what is a woman, I'll be happy to align with the majority of the queer community and queer scholarship and feminist scholarship that in the simplest sense, you have a spectrum of in biology, male and female, that in various species, those are the majority expression, right? But then there's in between, there's hermaphrodites and stuff, and so that's sex. And then gender, it's more socially constructed, it's more based on identity, and it's more fluid. And so, male, female, man, woman, like there's a parallel there. And then in both cases, there's in between. And so on a policy level, we just need to be able to sort of declare that as science. And it's a public education issue. Largely when it comes to people like Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, it's textbook moral panic. They're taking either sort of hyperbolic statements of the left or they're just being bad faith and twisting what the scholars are trying to say, or they're painting them into a corner to make them look foolish. It's a kind of inversion of like what Sacha Baron Cohen does, in terms of like that subversive propaganda. And ironic. And so, Matt McManus calls what they're doing, he calls the intellectual dark web postmodern conservatism. Right. And I agree with that. I'd also kind of describe it in hypermodern terms and just generally speaking, describe everything that's happening as a kind of latency, so that, like I said, the 90s, there was debates about postmodernism, and we've been rehashing it for 30 years. And in terms of Ben Shapiro, I think and Matt Walsh with this film or whatever, because I think it's a great sort of object of study, because Ben Shapiro is like anti-Hollywood because of all the pride and wokeness and females in movies and stuff. But then at the same time, he's pushing his own production studio. Right. Like he's now making movies. He's made a film, in fact, and it's been reviewed by a movie reviewer who I check out sometimes. So I haven't seen the film. It's probably laughably awful, but this is what I mean by latency and kind of inversions and postmodern conservatism, that they're adopting the tools that the left used traditionally, which was like media, communication, art, and they're just using it to push bigotry, to be cryptic and crypto sexist, crypto racist about it. You don't think
that in terms of that they don't go too far sometimes? I give you a personal anecdote, because I know it's an anecdote and so on, but it's I had a visitor here, and he is a plastic surgeon from Amsterdam, and he does also this transgender operations. And so I'm asking him, like, bluntly, how many of these people want to go back after a year? And he said at least 50%. And that's a lot from my point of view.
Yeah.
And so there's no what I would wish for, would be a debate about basically about nature and nurture. It sounds a bit weird, but I think there are like, I actually dated a transgender woman once. So
okay.
Okay. So, and this woman was always a woman, although it was born as a man and yada, yada. But for me, always a woman. And there never was a debate about that. But then there's also these kind of reverberating effect society has on people, so that the rate of identifying as transgender goes up and ultimately makes people more unhappy. And so, but there's no discussion, like a reasonable discussion about the societal effect that it has by, and so I think that would be useful to have.
Yeah. So, yeah, so, I get that the thrust of your question is about the excesses, and I will comment on that. So I'll start by saying, though, that statistic of 50%,
right?
Like I would be skeptical of that, because I've seen data from a paper that, I could dig it up. I don't know where it is, but the exact same type of metric of asking how many trans people end up regretting it or having dysphoria or whatever. And the statistic they gave was 0.3%. I think, right? Like in that ballpark. And so 0.3,
Sure.
Even if we round it up to 1%, that's a world of difference from 50%. And so the broader point I'm trying to make is that in these public debates, often there's a lot of alternative facts, right? To use
No, well, I
Donald
said it
Trump's
is anecdotal,
Yes, you did. You qualified it. So so there's that, and then the point about the conversation not being had. I would argue that if you know where to look, every conversation is being had in academia, adjacent to academia, on TV, in graduate seminars, everywhere. It's often hard to find the exact conversation you're looking for. And jumping in at the level that you want to be, and all that. I think that can be very difficult in the sea of information and the cacophony of voices out there. But just as a general point, I would argue that almost everything's been said, almost everything's been written about, debated in moderate terms and extreme forms. If you look long enough and deeply enough, it's all out there. And that's why history is sort of repeating itself, because there's a lot of people like, oh, I want to talk about this. It feels like it's being suppressed. And in some cases it is being suppressed because the conversation's already been kind of had. So there's those kind of ironies. When it comes to the excesses of the left, whatever they may be, more often than not, especially with trans issues, queer issues, like, or racial issues, because I'm a white man, I know what my place is, and I'm totally comfortable with that. Like, it's not my place to speak over those people or experts in the field, or to be a contrarian, to make a specific point about that. Like, generally speaking, I want to be supportive, and I want to be skeptical of the right-wing talking points about a given issue, because there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of self-delusion, a lot of bad faith among these right-wing pundits, even particularly the most popular ones. You have Alex Jones on the far right. People like him who are just there, and they admit to being a performer to a large extent, so that it's very muddy and complicated. And then on the far left, you have people like Jon Stewart, who also admits to being a performer and kind of getting a rise out of people. But people like the intellectual dark web phenomenon, because most of them identified kind of closer to the center, and as an experiment, it was about coming together in the center. And so it was a group legitimizing experience, right? And I call it a mutual backpatting society. They all perform being friends and stuff. And it's very interesting. Like, if we focus on Dave Rubin and Ben Shapiro, for example, there's this constant tension that goes back and forth, and leftists comment on it, because Dave Rubin's gay and Ben Shapiro is anti-gay. And they'll both say, like, yeah, we're friends. But Ben Shapiro, like, wearing his trademark shit-eating grin, will be like, yeah, I don't support gay marriage. Like, I wouldn't bake you a gay wedding cake. And then Dave Rubin kind of tries to take it like as a joke, and like, oh, we're buddies, and like, oh, I respect your faith and your tradition. So there's all these contradictions.
I don't really want to talk about Dave Rubin, and because I can't really take them seriously. Both of them, they're kind of weird for me. For me, it's like because you mentioned Jon Stewart.
That's my point. Just in terms of who frames the narrative of the excesses of the left, it's largely people like them with big platforms. That it's great you don't take them seriously, but
the point is, you mentioned Jon Stewart. I loved Stewart for years till his new program, where he kind of did a I don't even know how to describe it. Where is he gone hard left now, or what happened there?
No, I think he's a mixed bag. I think a lot of hard leftists don't like him. So I'd say he's definitely not as far left as you would think. I respect him, but and he does broach some kind of cutting edge topics. Like, he had Stephanie Kelton on to talk about modern monetary theory. And that gets a lot of people excited because it's this paradigm shift kind of thinking that we need. But there's lots of leftists who criticize him for various reasons. But what, yeah, coming back to the excesses of the left, the so-called excesses, I think a lot of it is just kind of ginned up controversy. That's not to say, it's all false, but I have, my own story with disillusionment with social justice activism is sort of full of empathy in a sense. Because I would look at like volunteers, standing on a street corner doing a petition, and just feel a few things. I'd feel, oh, they're bothering me. They want to waste my time, and that's kind of a selfish feeling. I want to support the cause. Often I would tell them, hey, I don't have any money. I can't, I'll sign your thing, but I can't give you anything. And I think it's already kind of captured, insofar as I don't think it's going to work. And so that's part of the tragedy of left activism too, is a lot of it is just captured, and the resources and the organizing that they're trying to do ultimately isn't enough leverage for the big change that we need.
Okay, before we come to metamodernism, because I find it quite interesting to just round that up, this kind of pastiche about who's who in the American public left. So what do you think of Andrew Sullivan? Because I know he had like a very bad episode in the 90s with a eugenic thing, I think, where he where he had like this thing where he compared IQ to race or something. But then again, he's like an openly gay man, I think, and very prolific writer. And from my point of view, with pretty leftist kind of views, at the same time, critical of, let's say, the excess of the left. So, where would you situate him on the spectrum?
There's a lot to say about him. In some ways. Not in all ways, but in some ways I'll group him with Dave Rubin insofar as they're both gay men who are comfortable and established. And once they have that level of comfort, they can kind of disengage from the movement politics about those issues, because they think, oh, I have mine. It doesn't affect me. And oh, by and large, gay marriage is legal. We've made these advances. We're good. People can stop bemoaning oppression. But I think Andrew Sullivan is part of a centrist pundit class, Dave Rubin aside, that people like Connor Friedersdorf, David Brooks, they write for The Atlantic, they write for the New York Times. These are really established, really powerhouse publications. And but
David Brooks is way more right than Sullivan, isn't he?
I don't know. It might depend on the issue. I mean, David Brooks is very cordial, and non-threatening, but he supported the Iraq War, and things like this. They're career columnists, so they just get paid to write article after article, and I think that lowers the quality a lot, generally speaking. But I wanted to make that kind of observation. But there's a few things about Sullivan I want to hone in on. He had an appearance on Jon Stewart's show 3-4 months ago that went viral because Andrew Sullivan, they were talking about racism, and Andrew Sullivan was like, what is systemic racism? What are these systems? He was being really facetious and really just flippant. Like, what are these? Like, I've never heard of this before. Like, what are these systems? And it turned out to be a really embarrassing thing. Like, Jon Stewart kind of made jokes at his expense, and maybe it was a lost opportunity as well to dive deeper. But Jordan Peterson made exactly the same sentiments maybe 6 months before that. What are systems? That's just some poetic kind of academic language. And the truth is, there's an enormous amount written about whether we call it systemic or institutional or structural racism or sexism or whatever it is. and it has a very precise meaning. And people like Peterson will say it's low resolution to say systemic anything. And it could be if you're just using it in a real casual kind of like naive way. But Andrew, so my point about Sullivan though is that he asked the question as a rhetorical question, like, what are these systems? What is, system? There's no systems. And he doesn't want an answer. So that's my fundamental impression about people like Andrew Sullivan is they ask the question, they don't want an answer, or they don't like the answer that they get. And it's just fundamentally disingenuous, I think. And I wish they could do better, like not to be kind of, paternalistic, but like, I don't want to be this cynical about those pundits, but they're just they have cushy jobs. They write for a living. So it comes out of them like very easily. And it's got this like pseudo intellectual crust across the whole thing, which, 5-10 years ago, I probably wouldn't have noticed. I probably wasn't as critical or astute to really be able to get an immediate impression where these people landed on the political spectrum and what their ultimate vision was. On paper, a lot of these people are arguing for a better world, of course, but they're always reducing it to the problem being in the woke class or the students or the activists or whatever. And I think that's fundamentally harmful and a non-starter. And maybe if I could briefly fill in a little bit more to talk about John Haidt, because
about
you
who? Jonathan Haidt?
him from time to time. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So I saw an interview of him not too long ago, like maybe 2 weeks ago. I forget which network it was on, one of these mainstream networks, and it's just one of these like 5 to 10 minutes kind of clips, right? And watching it, I've never really written on Haidt. I've commented in passing in places. I've been critical of him, but I've never like taken the time to unpack it because he's one of the more innocuous thinkers. Lots of people quote him. He's got lots of accolades, got lots of titles. Like Steven Pinker, like he's got a big fan base, and he's innocuous. But I also think that's a good reason to focus on him as an example, because this interview clip was, it could have been written by a Jonathan Haidt AI bot because it was so textbook, like everything he talks about. I thought to myself, like, maybe I should do a kind of breakdown of this. Like maybe I should like play the clips, go through it, analyze it, and, compose myself so it's credible and kind of give a balanced critique and perspective of this guy that hasn't been given yet, because people have criticized him. Like there's been lots of articles and stuff published, like with Pinker and other people, but very little of that discourse breaks through to the kind of mainstream and to his audiences and to Haidt himself. But the gist of his comments in a brief, 5-minute clip were like, oh, it's the students, they're all coddled, and things used to be different. And, we got to take our country back. There's a lot of explicit kind of reactionary language and kind of hearkening to the past. And I was so kind of activated by it because it was such a predictable speech pattern for him. And it was so reactionary, but like framed in terms of his authority that, I'm just speaking as an academic and this is what the literature says, So it'll often say things like, we did a study and what the data showed was, this and this and this. And I just think it's very clear that he's oversimplifying, and like Andrew Sullivan, to kind of connect it with him, he's taking this a very particular, it's filtered through a very particular ideology. And so, and that's, largely status quo capitalist. And it's always been a curiosity to me that one of Haidt's titles is like professor of business ethics.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so, so I'm thinking, okay, He's an expert on business ethics. Why is he never talking about that? And he's always talking about the excesses of woke culture and of students. And so there's this sort of obsession and kind of dwelling on that narrative as the problem. And I don't think that's the ultimate deep-rooted problem.
Okay, so because of time issues, let's zone in a little bit on left and metamodernism, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so, because we're talking about the different strands and shades of blue, let's say. So, talking about metamodernism, what I ask a little bit provocatively: which part of the left should be part of metamodernism? All of it, or should the left kind of transform? Or should the metamodern philosophical corpus kind of settle down on existing kind of leftist policies? So,
yeah, so there's different schools of thought, obviously, and I've kind of isolated them as the Nordic school, the Dutch school, and then a kind of generic school, or if you will, my sort of abstract approach, which includes doing all the research of the literature review, and kind of a bit of revisionism, which is to say there was metamodern theories put forward in the 90s, which no one had talked about. Nobody had brought forth until I started doing that. And so I try to take the broadest view possible of all these sources and how they interact and the communities that they foster. But if we just focus on the Dutch school and the Nordic school, the Dutch school authors explicitly identify as left-wing, right? Like that's their...
We're talking about Vermoyen and Van der Ecker, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And their extended community. Like that's their tradition. And that's also kind of the common standard in liberal arts and in sociology in particular. Like there's a coincidence there with left-wing politics for very good, tangible reasons. So there's that de facto kind of relationship. But Vermeulen,
yet they see Trump as a metamodern phenomenon, like an explicit.
To clarify that, they say metamodernism can explain Trumpism just as it can explain Bernie Sanders. And so I agree with that. However, I try to add a little more context and nuance to say that a better theory would be to embrace hypermodernism because there's just as much literature there, and use that to kind of juxtapose left and right. But Vermeulen and Van den Akker also say that their theory is not a movement. It's not normative.
It's not a political manifest.
Mm-hmm. And that they cast a wide net and they say it's all these cool movies and art things and include some sort of political ramifications and they do. Like I note this in a number of my essays, like they boil down the increasing contradictions in society to a potential eco-socialist path forward versus a kind of, they use the word fascist undertones, a kind of neo-fascist path, right? And so that does track with what I'm saying about a metamodernism versus hypermodernism as kind of competing meta memes amidst a postmodern decline. And focusing on Hansi, I make a similar argument that clearly they're social, social democracy, Scandinavia, Europe writ large, and they're trying to foster a kind of culture and way of thinking and do political interventions. And they have great terms like more egalitarian than socialism, more prudent and conservatism, right? And I like that they're equally trying to go beyond in the different traditional ideologies. However, like with the Dutch school, it's self-limiting in that it tries to take this sort of transcendent, transpartisan view. But by doing so, it kind of cuts itself off from the political mobilization that's happening in the world. So, they can go start a party like the Alternative, but it's not going to do very well. And it's going to be confused against the surges and organic movements of socialism around the world, right? So it's called the pink tide in Latin America. And so, the other metamodernisms that I draw from, Okadiji writes about kind of what I call black metamodernism, and there's not a lot of theory there, but I take the cue to make it consistent with a bunch of black radical scholarship and tradition. And so that's, one of my kind of goals here, obviously, is to foster a mass literacy of metamodernism, because we really haven't had a great literacy. We've had people that either read one book or they read another book, and they kind of have an insular conversation about what they think it means. But I think we're in a time crunch, and I think having academia embrace these things too is also important, which some scholars try to push, like Jason Storm. But there's not a lot of appetite for it, or there's skepticism towards it. So we continue to be stuck at this impasse. So the just to comment on the piece, but before we run out of time,
maybe
sure.
I can throw something in there, something that I just read. I have this beautiful book here from a German author called Gerd Köhnen. I mentioned that to you. It's called The Color Red. It's about the history of communism.
I think I looked it up and I could only see a German version.
It's not translated probably.
Exactly, so I can't read it.
and so the interesting lots of interesting things about it, but one that stuck recently in my mind was you mentioned Peterson and his critique, and he always said what the catastrophes of the communist history, and you think of Mao and Pol Pot and Stalin and whatnot, and the people that died through that system. But as this author describes it, it was kind of the point, because the intention behind it was that through the cracks that were instigated by these kinds of revolutions, through these breaks and cracks, the original communitas, the original kind of natural interaction and being between people, the good way of being together, comes through these cracks and finds its way to the top again. And so the program, the leftist program, the socialist communist program to rip the old structures apart, were kind of motivated by this hope that the original communitas comes back again. And so, but and that's why I'm mentioning it, because it's an explicit program, to shape society in a kind of way. Something that, let's say, the right, as far as I understand, either can't have, doesn't have the electoral mindset to do that, because, how many intellectuals really are there on the right? I mean, Steve Bannon is a kind of horrendous figure, but he's smart as shit. So, but you have this kind of program, and that was the reason why I mentioned Thaddeus Russell, because although you have to change, let's say, gun laws, you have to change that. You have to kind of be able to critique the approach. Well, let's shape society in our image. Right, do you get what I'm saying? And
I think so.
Yeah, and so where does metamodernism fit in there? Because how self-aware is it on the leftist, programs and narratives and algorithms? How does it want to reinforce it? How does it want to get of those things that are maybe not that functional?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it triggers a few things in my mind. I think I can answer it in a few different ways. One is, people, myself included, will point to like Donald Glover or Bo Burnham as metamodern artists and creators because of what they do. Both of them in terms of anti-racism, anti-capitalism, adding a kind of artistic commentary and almost a kind of praxis of like what to do about it, right? So it's not just like like nihilism, but it's like let's rebirth our own creativity, our own identity through that crisis, right? And like Bo Burnham's Inside is Inside film is taking you through that kind of journey and wormhole. And I often talk about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which there's a lot to talk about there. Like, and a lot of leftists are actually, they kind of disparage it. Like, oh, it's just popcorn and corporate consumer films. But there's a lot of metamodern actors and stuff that are involved in that. So the Russo brothers directed four of the Marvel films, and they also directed Community, a show that's very meta, very comedic, and about, it's in the title, community, right? It's clear what they're trying to build, what they're trying to invite viewers to in terms of world building, and how that tracks with bigger public works projects, let's say. And so like a Green New Deal, one of the kind of very short articles that I threw out there once was titled, "We Need to Build the Statue of Responsibility." And that's I'd never heard of this thing until I came across it, but Viktor Frankl designed this building that was supposed to go on the West Coast to sort of symbolically and literally and architecturally be the counterpoint or the sister structure to the Statue of Liberty. So, the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast, and then you have a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast. It's a bit of an awkward name, but let's just accept it and embrace it, because the US needs that kind of beacon and meta-narrative organizing principle to galvanize a public to feel like they have a healthy national identity, right? Like, I think nationalism is largely kind of toxic, but we can't avoid it completely. It needs to be integrated as part of cosmopolitanism. The interesting thing is this building is actually quite beautiful. It's if you want to like bring it up or show it in the show notes, it's one arm coming down from the sky and one arm coming up, and the hands and forearms are grasping each other. And then there's like a viewing deck and a platform on the top. And so this would serve as kind of a tourist attraction, but also as kind of a museum, if you will, or education center.
All right. Mm-hmm.
And so I don't advocate for these things just for fun. It's about what it represents and what it can dovetail with in terms of actual policy change, right? So when Biden or whoever paints Black Lives Matter in big bold lettering on streets in Washington D.C., or when Nancy Pelosi kneels with the kente cloth and they have a big photo op, that's a kind of disgusting performative kind of virtue signaling that doesn't translate to actual change, actual policy shift, actual restitution and reparations, if you will. So I'm trying to answer your questions in those big imaginative terms, that there's things happening in pop culture. There's things happening with those proposals like the Statue of Responsibility. And, again, not to like, validate, socialist Russia, but the concept of socialist realism, which is based on that kind of applies here. That socialist realism refers to the propaganda and the kind of narrative creation of a kind of like large civic engagement project, right? And Green New Deal could be something like that, where you have massive infrastructure building, jobs that creates, but also trying to greenify the economy, green sources of energy, and sustainable construction practices. There's lots of novel practices coming out, and maybe we're not quite there. Like, just to kind of close out on one of these excesses of the left when it comes to environmentalism, right? There's a lot of hype about, windmills and stuff. And Germany is actually a leader in wind power. but it's not without its trade-offs and its dark secrets, right? That there's problems with giant wind turbines, with how they're manufactured, how they're recycled or just buried in the ground, and the noise, the birds, whatever. So we do need, and this comes back to like nuclear. There needs to be a nuclear power kind of factor in the energy discourse and in the energy kind of global energy crisis as part of supplementing the solutions. So there are excesses on the left, but I never want to start there. I never want to like justify the narratives against it. And I think the metamodern utopia, so to speak, whether it's solar punk and Afrofuturist kind of aesthetics, it's gesturing towards hypercriticism, but like also like solutions in terms of leading by example, or like whether it's an artist like Bo Burnham trying to break the mold, or an architect and philosopher like Viktor Frankl. This is the vision I'm trying to consolidate.
Before, because I don't know if you have heard of Robert Faller. He's like he's one of the big German-speaking. He's actually from Austria. He's a professor of philosophy. He wrote a couple of books. His main argument, and I found that very interesting, is that all these whatever you might think of, gender pronouns and identity politics and whatever positive effect they had, you can't turn. That's his argument. You can't turn away from the fact that it kind of obstructs. It turns away your attention from solving the big problem that we have, which is climate change. And so that is his. When his book came out, when he was like kind of proposing this argument, that was kind of a big deal, because that is the big issue that we're having, and diverting our attention to who uses which bathroom, and being so, engulfed with these kinds of micro conflicts where this big thing is looming very near into the future. That's a systemic problem, right? So that, and so in that kind of way, the left is shooting, the bullet in its own knee in a kind of way. And
yeah. I would agree with that. I would frame it slightly differently myself, again, to kind of portray the fragmentation of the left as a kind of result of different interference and warfare. But this is an argument that I would make too, that a lot that whether it's the right or just the capitalist ethos producing a divide and conquer strategy, it's working. We're all very divided and spread thin. It's also a function of specialization, though, right? The more scholars specialize in their lane and their tunnel,
right,
the less integration, the less generalization we have. So it's a function of that kind of trend too. And so I try to do the hardest thing, which is to accept that critique, but try to also say, hey, they're not mutually exclusive, even if they seem like it. And it really would seem like it if we're talking about what do trans bathrooms have to do with climate change. But I would say we can and we have to solve all of these problems together. Right. And that's a very tall order, right? Like, how do we make the time to onboard people to the level of understanding and of one issue to help them move on to the next issue, right? And the left does have a problem in terms of getting and wielding power. This is a critique that lots of prominent leftists have made, that it's like the example is, even if Bernie Sanders did win, he'd be very obstructed and it'd be difficult for the left to wield power. And to bring it back to metamodernism, this is why
that's one of the systems that inhibit a kind of the policy making, then it wouldn't be much make of a difference if Bernie Sanders would be in office. Not that much, probably.
Mm-hmm. It's debatable, right? Like I'd love to have that debate too, because it's just novel territory. But what was I going to say there? Sorry, I forgot.
Sorry, I interrupted you there. No, okay. So, but you said two things, and maybe we can. You wanted to go to metamodernism.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I note in the piece, like, and I got some feedback in trying to formulate this. Is like, is the Bernie Sanders movement metamodern or not? And I would say because they lost, then no, it's not, because we should be winning. And that's why I was trying to be an activist in these spaces, to say, like, and to gesture to the Bernie movement too, like that it has to do better. It has to find, like, and I think Bernie's great. And I thought the campaigning generally was great. I mean, he achieved a level of success that was unexpected. And so that should be celebrated and held on to. But the perspective, given that nobody was talking about metamodernism and everyone was still talking about postmodernism in mainstream culture, I did see an opportunity to try to sell the idea and try to mobilize and organize leftists to think in this broader way. And I think Hansi does do a good job in elevating the thinking and the complexity and the perspective on politics. And I think Vermeulen and Van den Akker and their sphere also do a good job. But I also found it to have some flaws and be lacking in certain respects. And so when it comes to the Bernie movement, I kind of make the point that there's like, and Sam Ludford, had some comments on this, but like there's a flashes of insight that we could call metamodernism, and, thresholds being crossed and things happening. Like one kind of coincidence, this isn't in the piece, but comes to mind. One of Bernie Sanders's rallies, this is when he was peaking in 2016. A very cute little bird came and landed on his podium. And it was this kind of like, not an omen, but like a sign, like a sign from God, if you will, kind of synchronous. It's meant to be, of course it wasn't meant to be, but there were certain aesthetics that I'm trying to point to. And I did write a kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of comparison between Bernie, Clinton, and Trump that I posted in 2017. That was like, clearly we have a kind of like meta post and hyper expressions of what's going on, right? Referring back to the beginning of our conversation when I said there's a left, center, and right. And is my video frozen?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry about that. Try to get back online here. Okay.
There you are.
Okay, might be a bit choppy, but I'll just finish that thought. So I actually had like 20 memes that showed like, for example, one that comes to mind is Bernie Sanders was a peace dove, and maybe Trump or Clinton was like a war hawk. Clinton was a war hawk, and I think Trump was a bald eagle or something, right? So I was trying to make a joke about the different birds that they represent and how those expressions, war hawk, peace dove, that they kind of actually track and map with political orientation, military decisions in particular. And so there's 20 memes that kind of juxtapose those. And so metamodernism in the left, right? Where do they line up? Where do they dovetail? There's a lot of points of contact. Or there, podcasts happened or mentions happened, but there was never a kind of flowering across the left of this conceptually. It became stuck and is stuck, I think, in our kind of discourse circles. And so we're still trying to figure out where to go next with it. And, thankfully, you and I are talking about this today, trying to figure that out.
Right.